The thing about the Veilhari was that they never stopped reminding you what you were. Not cruelly. That was the part that got to me. It wasn't malice. It was the way you remind a houseplant that it's a houseplant, a gentle, thoughtful clarification offered for everyone's benefit, especially yours. You are Terran. You do not navigate by the singing lines. You do not feel the current pull of deep space the way we do. You are our guest, our student, our interesting little diplomatic arrangement. You are welcome here. You are not one of us. My name is Dara Osai, and I spent 4 years on the VAF Sorvith, the Veilhari Admiralty Fleet Carrier Sorvith, as the only human being within 6 light years in any direction. I was the human liaison to the 3rd Drift Armada, which sounds impressive until you understand that my actual job was translating cultural friction into forms the Admiralty could politely ignore. I attended briefings I wasn't cleared for, and then filed reports nobody read. I ate alone because Veilhari meal communion was a sacred act of species bonding, and my presence disrupted the resonance. I trained with the fleet's forward scouts because their commander, Vice Admiral Theravel Sorvith, believed that a liaison who couldn't hold a formation in vacuum was a liability. But when the real ops ran, I held position 3 kilometers back and watched on sensors. 4 years. I could recite the Veilhari fleet charter in 3 dialects. I could identify every class of warship in the Armada by engine signature alone. I knew which junior officers were sleeping together and which senior officers were pretending not to know. I knew the Sorvith's maintenance cycles, her crew rotations, her emergency protocols. I knew more about the Veilhari 3rd Drift Armada than most Veilhari who served in it. I want to be precise about what 4 years of that kind of knowing felt like. It was not loneliness exactly. I'd been lonely before in my life, the specific homesick ache of being far from things you understood, and this wasn't quite that. The Veilhari were genuinely kind. They had a phrase in formal register that translated approximately as honored guest whose understanding we value, and it was not empty courtesy. They meant it. They gave me access to materials and briefings and training exercises that no human had been given before. They answered my questions with patience and genuine interest in being understood correctly. Theravel Sorvith spent hours of her own time in the first 6 months teaching me Veilhari vacuum maneuver protocols, which I had no operational need for, simply because she thought it was important that I understand how they moved and why. But there was always a moment, in every interaction, when the Veilhari equivalent of a door closed. I don't mean that uncharitably. It wasn't conscious. Most of them weren't even aware it happened. It was more like the moment when 2 people who have been having a real conversation reach the edge of what shared language can cover, and one of them nods and the other nods back, and you both agree to not push past that edge today. You can see the thing on the other side of it. You know it's there. But the translation doesn't exist yet, and there's work to do, and so you stop. I spent 4 years being the person who always stopped at that edge. And still, at the end of every shift, I went back to my quarters, which were slightly smaller than everyone else's, not by design, just by how Veilhari ships were built. Nothing personal, and I lay on my bunk and I stared at the ceiling and I thought, I am the wrong kind of bird for this nest. I had no idea how right I was, or how wrong I was about what it meant. The reliquary appeared on long-range sensors on a Tuesday, which tells you everything about how unprepared we were for it. Not a Veilhari calendar Tuesday, they don't have those. My personal calendar Tuesday. I was eating a protein block and reading a month-old news packet from Earth when the proximity alert sang. A Veilhari alert is a low, resonant chord, different tones for different threat levels, and this one was a tone I'd never heard before. Not danger. Something older than danger. Something the alarm systems didn't have a category for and had defaulted to acknowledging in the oldest frequency in their memory. I dropped the protein block and went to the bridge. The bridge of the Sorvith was a cathedral of blue light. Curved walls, bioluminescent panels, stations shaped for bodies that were taller and more articulated than mine. I had a station in the back, observation, technically, and I slipped into it without drawing attention, which was easy because every Velhari on the bridge was staring at the forward display. What I saw didn't make immediate sense. It was a ship, that much was clear, but it was the size of a small moon, and it was old in a way that made the Sorvith feel like a toy. Its hull was dark metal, the color of deep space, with faint luminescence moving beneath it like blood under skin, slow, rhythmic, almost respiratory. It had no visible engine ports, no weapons signatures, no crew communication signals. It was a dead thing, or something pretending to be dead, or something so far beyond our definitions of alive and dead that the categories no longer applied. Fleet Commander Arash Vel Sorvith stood at the center of the bridge and said nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. He was a lean, silver-haired Velhari, the kind who looked like he'd been carved from cold stone specifically to look authoritative in moments of crisis. Then he spoke 4 words in formal Velhari that even my translation chip needed a moment with. He said, "The cradle has returned." Every Velhari on the bridge touched their throat, a reflex, the way humans touch their chest when they're startled by something sacred. I did not know what the cradle was. I would spend the next 6 hours learning. The Velhari were not the oldest spacefaring species in this region of the galaxy. They were proud enough of their 40,000-year history that this fact rarely came up, but it was true. Someone had been here first. The evidence was scattered, anomalous ruins on dead moons, mineral formations that didn't occur naturally but weren't any known alloy, navigation beacons still transmitting signals in a language nobody had successfully decoded. Velhari archaeologists called the absent architects the Veth, untranslatable, but roughly, the ones before the ones before. The cradle was Veth. According to the oldest Velhari records, it had appeared twice before in documented history, once 60,000 years ago, once 22,000 years ago. Each time, it had stayed for a period ranging from weeks to months, and each time it had left behind what the records described as a gift. The first time, a set of navigation techniques that had allowed the Proto-Velhari to achieve deep space travel centuries ahead of their natural development. The second time, a biological compound that had effectively ended a plague killing 30% of the Velhari population per generation. Both times, the cradle had chosen someone. That was the word in the records, chosen. A single individual Velhari who had approached the cradle and been, the records were unclear here, recognized, accepted, given access, and through that individual the cradle had communicated its gift. The individual chosen 22,000 years ago was the most celebrated figure in Velhari history. Her image was on their currency. Her name was the first word taught to Velhari children. She was, in every meaningful sense, the founding saint of the modern Velhari civilization. Her name was Sorvith Vel Arash. The fleet and its carrier were named for her. Every ship in the Third Drift Armada carried her name somewhere in its registry. I understood now why Fleet Commander Arash Vel Sorvith had said nothing for 11 seconds. He was looking at his ancestors' miracle, the thing that had made his people what they were. And now it was back. Vice Admiral Thera Vel Sorvith found me in the observation station during the 4th hour of analysis. Thera was not like most of the senior officers. She was younger than her rank suggested, the Velhari equivalent of mid-30s, which in their lifespan meant she'd moved fast, and she had a way of looking at things, at problems, at me, that was different from how the others looked. Most Velhari looked at me with calibrated courtesy. Thera looked at me the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet, not dismissive, genuinely puzzling over it. She stood beside my station and looked at the cradle on the display for a long moment. "You've been reading the archive files," she said. "Not a question. My console log was accessible to senior staff." "I have," I said, 47 documents. Most of them are transcriptions of oral histories, because the original records from 60,000 years ago are fragmentary. What did you learn? I thought about it. That the cradle doesn't open for just anyone. That there have been 12 documented attempts to board it over the centuries, explorers, researchers, a Velhari admiral named Tova who brought an armada, and none of them got past the outer hull. It only opened for Sorvith Vel Arish, and the records say she came alone. Thera was quiet. What's the plan? I asked. Fleet Commander Arish will attempt to establish contact tomorrow. His lineage is direct. He's the 8th generation descendant of the Sorvith line. If the cradle responds to hereditary connection, he has the strongest claim. And if it doesn't? Thera looked at me, not the careful, courteous look, the problem you haven't solved look. Then we wait, she said, or we try others. She didn't say, you are one of the others we might try. She didn't have to. I felt it in the space her words left. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my bunk and thought about Sorvith Vel Arish walking alone toward a ship the size of a small moon 22,000 years ago. What she'd felt, whether she'd been afraid, whether she'd known before she got close that it was going to open for her. Fleet Commander Arish's approach on the second day was beautiful. I watched it from the observation deck, a single formal shuttle, polished to a mirror shine, moving across the gap between the Sorvith and the cradle with the gravity of ceremony. Behind him, the full third drift armada held position in a perfect crescent formation, 37 warships. It looked like a religious procession, which it was. The cradle did nothing. He came within 100 meters of the outer hull. The luminescence beneath the dark metal didn't change. No hatches, no response. The hull was smooth and black and utterly indifferent. He waited for 2 hours, nothing. He came back. The Admiralty spent the rest of the day in closed session. I filed a report that nobody read and ate dinner alone in the commissary. On the third day, they tried Admiral Sorvith's senior staff in sequence. One at a time, formal shuttles, the same ceremony. 11 officers, nothing. On the fourth day, the argument started. I heard them through walls I wasn't supposed to be able to hear through. The Velhari had better acoustic insulation than humans, but they also got louder when they argued, and the argument on day 4 was very loud. Half the Admiralty wanted to attempt a forced breach. The other half cited the historical record. Every forced breach attempt had resulted in catastrophic system failure for the attempting ship. Not attack. The attempting ship simply stopped working. Power gone in vacuum with no explanation. Thera was in the middle of it. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught hers more than others. She had a voice that cut clean, even through 3 centimeters of composite wall. On the 5th day, she came to find me again. I want you to read something, she said, and handed me a data tablet. The document on it was a sub-file from the historical archive. Not a primary record, a commentary, written by a Velhari historian named Vel Meth approximately 800 years ago, analyzing the original accounts of Sorvith Vel Arish's encounter with the cradle. Vel Meth's argument was careful and precise, and completely ignored by subsequent scholarship. He proposed that the historical records had been misread. The common interpretation was that the cradle had chosen Sorvith Vel Arish because she was Velhari, because she was the right species, the right genetics, the right resonance frequency. Vel Meth argued the opposite, that the cradle had chosen her because of who was standing beside her. The records, when read carefully, described 2 figures approaching the cradle. Sorvith Vel Arish was the famous one. The other was named in a single footnote, described only as her companion, a being from a distant system who had arrived on Velhari space during the Plague years and joined Sorvith's research expedition. The being's species was noted but not elaborated on. Vel Meth had tracked down every surviving reference. The companion was human. I read the document twice, then I looked up at Thera. This is 800-year-old scholarship that the academic establishment dismissed as fringe, I said. Yes. You want to send me to the cradle. I want to consider the possibility that Vel-Meth was right, she said carefully. The cradle has not responded to any Velhari approach. The historical record is unusual. You are the only human being in 6 light years. That's a significant leap from the historical record being unusual. Yes, she said again, and then quietly, I know what it is to argue for an uncomfortable reading of evidence. The Admiralty will not approve this proposal. A pause. I'm not asking for Admiralty approval. I looked at her, then what are you asking? I'm asking if you want to go. The honest answer was, I was terrified. I was a liaison officer eating protein blocks alone in a commissary on a carrier that barely had room for me in its design specifications. And she was asking me to take a shuttle alone toward an alien artifact the size of a moon that had turned every Velhari who tried to approach it away without a word. The other honest answer was, yes. When, I said. Tonight, she said, before anyone can stop us. The shuttle she gave me was small. Not a formal shuttle, those were logged and tracked. A maintenance crawler, technically, the kind used for hull inspection. It smelled like coolant and had a single forward port that gave me a view about as inspiring as a bathroom window. It was perfect. I went out at 200 hours ship time when the watch rotation was at its thinnest and the Admiralty was asleep. Thera cleared me through the service bay without a logged record. I didn't ask how. I didn't ask what would happen to her if this went badly. I just went. The crossing took 47 minutes. I held the crawler at minimum thrust to reduce sensor signature, moving in the shadow of the Sorvith's hull until I was past the Armada's picket perimeter, and then easing out into open space. Then the cradle was ahead of me, and everything else fell away. 47 minutes of nothing but that view. I played music. It seemed like the right thing to do. I had a collection on my personal drive, accumulated over 4 years of being the human on a carrier that didn't play human music, added to on every monthly data packet from home. I put on an old piece, something my grandmother had kept on a scratchy record that I'd converted to digital when I was 12, because I was afraid the record would stop working. I don't know why I chose that particular piece for that particular crossing. I think I wanted something that was entirely mine, something that was specifically from where I came from, old and human and entirely untranslatable into any Velhari equivalent, that I could carry with me into a space where everything was old and alien and waiting. It was a good 47 minutes. I don't have the right words for what the cradle looked like up close, even now. It's not that I hadn't seen big things in space. The Sorvith was a kilometer long, and there were moons and gas giants in this system. But scale isn't the thing that gets you. It was the feeling of age. The hull wasn't just dark. It was the kind of dark that comes from being in vacuum for a very long time, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. The luminescence underneath moved slowly, like something breathing in deep sleep. I found myself slowing the crawler without deciding to. I killed the music at 200 meters. It felt right to do it in silence from there. At 300 meters, I stopped entirely. I just sat there. The stars were very bright out here, further from the system star than most of the fleet's regular patrol zones. The cradle hung in the middle of all that dark and light and said absolutely nothing. And I sat in the maintenance crawler and said absolutely nothing back, and the silence between us had a quality I couldn't immediately name. Then I realized what it was. It wasn't hostile silence. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of something that was paying attention. Then I started talking. I don't know why. It wasn't a calculated decision. I think I was nervous, and when I'm nervous I fill silence with sound. My mother had told me this was a liability. My xenolinguistics professor at the academy had told me. It was one of the most distinctively human social behaviors she documented. This reflexive vocalization in the face of uncertainty. This reaching for connection through sound, even when you had no reason to believe the sound would be received. I said, "My name is Dara Osai. I'm a human being. I'm from Earth, that's the third planet of a yellow star about 600 light years from here. I've been living with the Veilhari for 4 years. I know a lot about them. I like them. They've been very kind to me mostly, and they've taught me a great deal, and I think there's a historian named Vel Meth who had an interesting idea about you and someone like me, about 22,000 years ago." Silent the stars. The breathing dark of the hull. "I don't know if you understand me," I said. "I don't know if you understand language. I don't know if you're awake in any sense I'd recognize." A pause. "I know what it's like to be in a room where the language doesn't quite fit, where you understand enough to know what's happening but not enough to say the right thing at the right moment. I've spent 4 years in that room. If you're in a version of that room right now, if you're awake and present and just not sure how to open a conversation with something like me, I want you to know that's okay. I'm patient. I was trained to be patient." I stopped, reconsidered. "Actually, that's not accurate," I said. "I wasn't trained to be patient. I had patience trained into me by 4 years of practice. There's a difference. I'm still working on it." Something changed in the hall, not structurally. The luminescence shifted slightly, a micro variation in rhythm that my sensors registered and that I felt as much as observed. "The Veilhari need help," I said. "There's something coming that they're not equipped to face with what they have. You've helped them before. You helped them 22,000 years ago, and according to the historical record, you had a companion with you the last time you did it. A human. I don't know what that human was like. I don't know if I'm the right kind of human or the wrong kind or if that distinction matters to you, but I'm the only human here and I figured." I stopped. "I figured someone should try," I said. "Someone should always try. That's the other thing about my species. We keep trying things that probably won't work because there's always the chance that they will." I was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to come closer," I said. "Is that okay?" Nothing, no answer. But also no system failure, no power drain, none of the things that had happened to the previous 12 attempts over the centuries. I pressed the throttle. At 50 meters, the hull began to change. Not dramatically, not a hatch slamming open, not light flooding out. The luminescence shifted. The slow, respiratory rhythm quickened slightly, as if something that had been in very deep sleep was beginning to surface. The dark metal itself seemed to, I don't have a better word, lean toward me, like a dog lifting its head. At 20 meters I felt it. Not through sensors, through me. A pressure at the base of my skull, not painful, not even unpleasant, just present, a feeling like someone putting their hand on your shoulder to get your attention. I'd had a grandmother who used to do exactly that. She'd lay her hand on my shoulder when I was young and distracted and far away in my thoughts, and she'd wait until I came back to the room. The cradle had that quality. I whispered, "I'm here." The hull opened. I cannot describe the interior. Not because it's indescribable, I've written about it in every official report I filed, and I'm not a bad writer, but because any description I give will immediately conjure the wrong image. You'll picture a spaceship interior because that's what you know. This was not a spaceship interior. It was more like the inside of something alive. The corridors, if corridors is the right word, curved and widened and narrowed in ways that seemed organic. The light was sourceless, a warm amber that seemed to come from the materials themselves. There was no gravity where I entered, and then there was, increasing gradually as I moved deeper in, as though the structure was deciding to accommodate me. There were surfaces I couldn't identify, not metal, not plastic, not biological tissue, something in between all three. The translator chip stayed completely silent, not because it was failing, because there was nothing to translate. The cradle communicated in something older than language. It communicated in knowing. I moved through those first passages for what I estimate was about 100 meters. though distances inside the cradle were not reliable in any conventional sense. The space seemed to breathe. Not literally. There was no atmospheric pressure change that my suit sensors registered, no mechanical movement, no pneumatic cycling. But some quality of the place created an impression of inhalation and exhalation, a rhythm underneath the silence that matched itself gradually, over the first several minutes of my passage, to my own breathing. I noticed it when my heart rate began to slow without my deciding to calm down. Something in the frequency of the light, perhaps. Something the Veth had known and designed for. I stopped in a wider chamber, roughly circular, the walls curving up and over into a ceiling I couldn't see from below, and I stood there and simply looked. The chamber had things in it. Not objects exactly. The word that kept arriving was records. They had the quality of records, dense, organized, preserved with care. They were embedded in the walls themselves, occupying volumes of the amber-lit material in formations that my eyes kept trying to read as script before my brain caught up, and reminded me that whatever system this was, it predated every writing tradition on every world I'd ever studied. They felt like information stored in crystal, except crystal was a woefully inadequate analogy. They felt like the space between moments, captured and pressed flat and held. I reached out and touched one, not thinking about it, pure instinct. The warmth was immediate. Not temperature, the surface had no temperature distinguishable from the surrounding air, but warmth in the way that certain objects carry warmth. An old photograph, a letter in handwriting you recognize, a book that someone you loved read before you. The warmth of having been held. Then the knowing began. It didn't arrive like data transfer. Nothing clinical about it. It came the way music comes when you've been away from it, and you hear a piece you knew in childhood, not a conscious parsing of notes and structure but a full-body recognition, something settling into its right place before your analytic mind has time to catch up and demand explanations. I found myself sitting on the floor without having made the decision to sit. My back against the curved wall, legs in front of me, both hands flat on the material of the floor. Okay, I thought, okay, I'm here, show me. The knowledge arrived in pieces, over what felt like hours but my chronometer said was 11 minutes. It wasn't transmitted like data. It was more like remembering something you'd never known, a deep memory sense, the way dreams sometimes feel more real than waking. I had to stop walking because my legs went unreliable. I sat down against a curved wall and let it come. I learned that the Veth were gone. Not extinct, the distinction mattered, though I couldn't have explained it then. They had completed something, moved beyond what this region of space had to offer, left into a frequency of existence the cradle didn't have a translation for, and I certainly didn't. They had left the cradle because the cradle was a gift that gave itself, a repository of the things they had learned and the capacities they had developed, maintained in the space between gift moments, waiting for the right moment to be needed. It had been here before, it would be here again. But it didn't give its gifts to anyone. The Veth had been, the knowing arrived awkward here, like a translation with no good target word, connectors. Species that bridged, species that didn't fit cleanly into their own ecological niche because they were evolved for something larger. Not superior, not stronger. There were species in the Veth's old records that were larger, more powerful, longer-lived. But there was something about the capacity to not belong that mattered. The capacity to live in two worlds and belong to neither, to be always slightly outside, to be the species that could look at any communication and find the gap where understanding might happen. I felt this arriving in me and felt, simultaneously, the long chain of my own history unspool in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not personal history, species history. The things my people had done that had never made clean sense when viewed from inside the assumption that humans were a normal kind of intelligent species, pursuing normal kinds of survival imperatives. The way we'd learned every language we'd ever encountered. The way we'd moved into every ecosystem, biological and social, not by outcompeting what was already there, but by finding the gap, the niche, the space between niches where nothing else had tried to live. The anthropologists, the linguists, the diplomats, the translators, the ones who walked into unfamiliar cultures and sat down and listened and said, "Explain it to me. Explain it to me again. I want to understand this the way you understand it." My grandmother, who had been raised in one country and educated in another, and married into a third, and had died speaking 4 languages fluently and 2 more passably, who used to say that knowing where you fully belong is less useful than knowing how to find belonging anywhere. I'd thought that was comfort, something she'd told herself to make peace with a life of displacement. I understood, in the amber light of a viewership, that she'd been describing a survival advantage so deep it had become a philosophy before we'd recognized it as strength. The Veth had known 3 such species in this region over the span of their long departure. Humans were the third. I sat against that warm amber wall and absorbed this and said, very quietly, "That explains a lot about us." Then the cradle showed me why it was here. The vision, if vision is the right word for something that arrived in all senses simultaneously, was not comfortable. It was the kind of honest that only things which have no stake in your emotional state can offer. I saw the deep space approach of what the Third Drift Armada was facing, and I understood immediately why the Valhari officers had been afraid in a way they didn't want to show. What I saw made no attempt to soften itself for my comprehension. I absorbed it the way you absorb very cold water, sudden, full body, no possibility of gradual adjustment. I sat with it for a moment, then I sat with it longer. Then I said, "Okay." Just that, just okay, because there was no point in anything else, and also because the Veth, having built a ship that communicated in the frequency of recognition and waiting, seemed to me like beings who would appreciate the economy of that word. "Okay, I see it. I am still here. Tell me the rest." I will not describe what the Valhari were facing in more detail than this. There was something coming through deep space that the Third Drift Armada could not fight with its existing technology. I'd been in 6 light-years of space for 4 years, and I'd never seen any Valhari officer afraid. On the bridge of the Sorveth, over the past week, I had seen Fleet Commander Arash Vel Sorveth afraid. That should tell you what they were facing. The cradle had seen it before. Not this particular threat. The universe is too large for perfect repetition, but this category of threat, and the category had a response, and the response was the gift the cradle was carrying this time. Not a weapon, not a technology exactly, more like a key. The cradle was a ship. An ancient one, yes, and vast, and built by beings who were operating on a different level than anything I'd ever studied. But it was a ship, with a ship's systems, and those systems could be made to interface with Valhari fleet technology, given the right translation layer. Given someone who spoke both languages, who could sit in the space between and turn the alien into the familiar and back again. Someone like me. I said, I need to understand what I'm committing to. The knowing shifted, patient waiting. If I do this, I said slowly, I'm not just opening a door. I'm the door. You're asking me to be the connection point. The cradle systems interface with Valhari fleet technology through me. Not quite yes, more specific than yes. Through us, I corrected. The Valhari and the humans together, that's the point. That's always been the point. It's not just me, it's me and Thera and the fleet and the relationship between our species. I'm just I searched for the word. The hinge. The amber light pulsed once slowly. I was on my feet before I decided to stand up. I need to get back to the Sorveth. I need to talk to Thera, and then we need to talk to everyone. I came out of the cradle at 4:37 hours, and within 3 minutes I had 11 Valhari warships locking targeting solutions on the maintenance crawler that was supposed to be doing hull inspection on the far side of the carrier. Thera's voice came through on the short range. "Osai. Fleet Commander Arash wants you court-martialed." Tell him I'll accept the consequences, I said. After I talk to him, please. A long pause. He says you have 5 minutes. I was talking for 4 of those 5 minutes before Fleet Commander Arash held up a hand and said, "Informal Velhari. Enough." I stopped. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're telling me that the cradle chose the human." "I'm telling you that Vel Meth was right," I said. "Sorvath Vel Arash didn't approach the cradle alone. She came with a human companion. The cradle opened because they came together. It's not about species superiority or hereditary connection. It's about the bridge between our species. That's the key." "The bridge," he repeated. "I've been living on this ship for 4 years as a bridge," I said. "A liaison, someone who exists between 2 cultures and belongs completely to neither. I always thought that was a weakness. I always felt like the seagull trying to learn to fly the wrong way." I stopped. "It wasn't a weakness. It's what I'm built for. What my species is built for. The cradle has been waiting for us to find each other." Arash was silent for a long time, long enough that I thought I'd lost him. Then he looked at Thera. Thera looked at him. Something passed between them, that fleet family communication that happens when 2 people know each other well enough to argue without words. I watched it happen and felt, for the first time in 4 years, that I knew what they were saying. Arash said, "What do you need?" What I needed was permission. What I needed was for the Admiralty to stop being afraid of the wrong thing. They were afraid that allowing a human to interface with the cradle meant that humans would claim it, that the gift would go to Earth and not to the Velhari, that they would come out of this diminished instead of helped. I understood the fear. I had spent 4 years in a culture that was kind to me and still, always, aware that I was not one of them. The fear of giving power to an outsider is old and universal. There was an admiral named Vel Korath who made the argument most sharply. He had the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller, not aggressively, just by the weight of his certainty. He stood in the Admiralty chamber and delivered the case against my proposal with the methodical precision of someone who has thought it through from multiple angles and has discarded all counterarguments in advance. The cradle was a Veth artifact, he said. It had appeared twice in Velhari history and given Velhari gifts. The historical footnote about a human companion was exactly that, a footnote. Vel Meth had been a fringe scholar for 8 centuries for good reason. The most parsimonious explanation for my experience was that I had entered the cradle because the cradle's outer hull had simply ceased to function as it had historically, age, entropy, something we didn't understand. My reception inside was a function of my translation equipment, my xenological training, my 4 years immersed in Velhari fleet culture. I had brought my own framework to an alien space and read meaning into what might be pattern. My interpretation of the deep knowing was exactly that, my interpretation. A human interpretation, inevitably shaped by human cognitive biases, by the particular way human beings find meaning in things they don't understand. He was not wrong to make this argument. It was a rigorous argument. I had thought several versions of it myself at 300 hours in my smaller-than-everyone-else's quarters over the preceding 4 years. But then Thera stood up. She said, "Admiral Vel Korath's argument is internally consistent, and I respect it. Contains one assumption worth examining." She pulled up the hull sensor data from the moment my crawler had approached the cradle. 11 Velhari military vessels had approached that hull over 5 days and achieved nothing. The hull's bioluminescent patterns had remained static, respiratory, indifferent. The moment my crawler crossed the 200-meter perimeter, the pattern changed. The rate of change was documented. The rate of change increased as I moved closer. The hull opened at 20 meters. "The simplest explanation," she said, "is also the most uncomfortable one. Something the cradle recognized was in the crawler, and the crawler contained one thing that none of the previous 11 approaches contained." She let that sit for a moment. "We can discuss why that might be true. We should discuss why that might be true. But I think we should begin from the fact that it is true." The vote, when it came, was 6-5. Velkoreth was one of the 5. He accepted the result with the dignity of a professional, and then, as the chamber dispersed, caught my eye across the room and gave me the flat palm acknowledgement that informal Velhari means. I still don't believe you, but I believe in the process that overruled me. I gave him the small bow that in diplomatic Velhari means. I know, and I respect that. We understood each other completely. Human training is good for something. Thera did most of the talking. I sat in the back of the Admiralty chamber, which was exactly where I'd been sitting for 4 years, and for once I didn't mind it. She stood at the center, and she argued with a precision that I think surprised even her superiors. She laid out Vel-Meth scholarship. She described the historical precedent. She pointed out, very quietly, that every attempt to approach the cradle alone had failed, and that the cradle had opened for me, and that perhaps the lesson was that the Veth had not built a gift for the Velhari alone. They built a gift for whoever was ready to work together, she said. 22,000 years ago we were ready. We are ready again, but only if we choose to be. 3 hours of argument, then a vote. 6-5. It wasn't a landslide. It was a crack in a wall, and we were going through it. We went back to the cradle at noon ship time with ceremony this time. Thera came with me, she had insisted, and nobody was in a position to argue with the officer who'd made the case that saved the vote. Behind us, 2 shuttles with a team of Velhari engineers who would handle the fleet-side interface work. The maintenance crawler was retired. I had an actual shuttle, formal, polished, logged. Thera sat beside me in the cockpit and looked at the cradle growing in the forward port and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You knew, didn't you, when I gave you the tablet with Vel-Meth's document, you already thought it might be true." "I didn't know," I said. "I hoped there's a difference." "What did it feel like?" "When the hull opened, I thought about my grandmother's hand on my shoulder, like being recognized," I said, "by something that had been waiting for a very long time." Thera was quiet for another stretch. "When I brought you Vel-Meth's document," she said, "Arish told me I was grasping at fringe scholarship because I was unwilling to accept that the cradle might simply not respond to us this time. He wasn't wrong. I was looking for a reason to hope." She paused. "I chose to hope in the direction of you." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "Thank you for teaching me to hold formation in vacuum." She laughed. It was a Velhari laugh, lower than a human one, a resonant sound in the chest, but it was real. "You were terrible at it for the first 6 months. I got better." "You did." The cradle was close now. The hull had already begun to change, the luminescence quickening, the lean of attention. It recognized the shuttle, or it recognized me, or it recognized us, which I was beginning to think was the truest way to say it. "Together," I said. "Together," Thera agreed. What followed was 9 days of the most complicated, exhausting, extraordinary work I have ever done or expect to do. The Velhari engineers were extraordinary, precise, patient, unwilling to make assumptions, exactly the kind of people you want beside you when you're translating between a 40,000-year-old fleet standard systems architecture and something that predates Velhari civilization by several orders of magnitude. I was the middle layer. The translation wasn't language. It was more fundamental than that. The cradle's systems expressed themselves in patterns that I absorbed through that same deep-knowing channel that the cradle had first used to speak to me, and I had to find the Velhari equivalent, the analog, the closest functional match, and convey it to engineers who would then render it in terms their own systems could use. It was not comfortable. I want to be clear about that because I think there is a version of this story in which the chosen human glows and speaks perfectly, and the ancient ship's wisdom flows through them like water through an open channel. It was not like that. I was a person sitting in an amber-lit corridor for 9 days, translating between 2 things that had no common vocabulary. And the process of doing that left me with splitting headaches and occasionally profound vertigo, and at least twice an hour a moment of complete cognitive freefall, where I lost track of which framework I was currently inside, and had to breathe carefully for 30 seconds and find my way back to myself. The engineers were patient with this. They were used to debugging. They treated my moments of vertigo the way good engineers treat unexpected system outputs, not as failures but as data. They asked careful questions when I came back to myself. They rephrased their own requests when I signaled that I was struggling to locate the Veilhari equivalent for a Veth concept. They did not suggest, even once, that perhaps a Veilhari should be doing this instead of me. I don't think that thought occurred to them. They were engineers. They cared about what worked, and I was what worked, and they were deeply respectful of things that worked. Thera was the one who kept us together. She had a gift I hadn't fully appreciated in 4 years of working beside her. She could hold multiple incompatible frameworks in her mind simultaneously, without forcing them to resolve. When an engineer insisted that a Veth system principle was impossible in Veilhari physics, she would hold both positions and find the question that dissolved the conflict. When I got lost in the deep knowing and came back confused and struggling to translate, she talked me back to the surface the way a diver's partner talks them through pressure sickness. Calm, clear, present. She also made sure I ate. This sounds like a small thing. On day 3, I had not eaten in 16 hours because I kept thinking I would stop at a natural break point, and the natural break points kept receding. And Thera appeared in the corridor where I was working and handed me a ration pack without a word and stood there until I'd finished it and then went back to what she'd been doing. Day 5, same thing. Day 7, I started to think of her as an anchor in a specific sense, not the kind that keeps you from moving, but the kind that tells you where the bottom is. On the 4th day, Fleet Commander Arish came through himself. No ceremony this time, just the commander in a work suit, looking tired. He pulled me aside in one of the cradle's amber corridors and said, "I owe you an apology." "No, sir," I said. "I do. I was going to court-martial you." "You had legitimate grounds." "I had fear," he said, "dressed up as grounds." He was quiet for a moment. "My ancestor came here with a human. I knew that footnote in the historical record. I had known it since I was a child. I chose not to consider its implications because—" he stopped. "Because the story of Sorvith Vel Arish is the story of the Veilhari rising to greatness through their own exceptional qualities. Changing the story is uncomfortable." "The story doesn't change," I said. "It just gets bigger. She was exceptional. The cradle recognized something in her, something real. It's just that what it recognized was also in who she traveled with." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You are very gracious about being used to confirm a theory." "I'm very grateful for 4 years of being included," I said. He made a gesture that I'd come to know over those years, palm flat, turned upward, a formal Veilhari acknowledgement of debt. Then he went back to work. On day 6, something unexpected happened. I was alone in one of the deeper chambers, working through a particularly dense cluster of Veth navigational data that I was trying to map onto Veilhari long-range sensor architecture when I felt the cradle shift its attention. Not much, a subtle thing, like a person in the same room with you turning slightly. The amber light didn't change. The temperature didn't change. But something did, and I stopped what I was doing and looked up. There was a new record on the wall. New is the wrong word. These records had been here for longer than human history, longer than Veilhari history, longer than anything I could personally measure. But it was new to me. It was in the section of wall I had been working near for 6 days, and hadn't been there when I'd started, which either meant I'd missed it, or the cradle had decided I was ready for it now. I reached out and touched it. What arrived was a face, or the Veth equivalent of a face, a form, a presence, something individual and specific in the way that individual beings are specific. I could not tell you what species they had been. The record was too old for that detail to survive in a form I could access, but there was a quality to the presence that arrived through the touch that was unmistakably personal, not the ship's knowing, something older, more particular, an identity. I sat with it for a long time. Then I understood. This was the one who had built the cradle. Or not built it alone, built it with others, over what must have been an extraordinary span of time, but the one whose particular intelligence had shaped what it became, its purpose, its selectiveness, the choice to make it a gift that waited rather than a gift that was given, the choice to key it not to species but to function, to capacity, to the particular gift that certain beings had for standing in the spaces between things. The founder had been that kind of being themselves. I said quietly, to a presence that could not hear me and yet felt somehow present, "You knew what you were building for. You knew what you were waiting for." The amber light pulsed once, slowly, the same way it had when I'd said the word us and gotten it right. I went back to work. On the 9th day we finished. The interface was elegant in the way that genuinely brilliant engineering is elegant, not complicated but profoundly right, each element in exactly the place that makes the most sense for what it needs to do. The cradle's gift was, as I'd understood it, not a weapon but a key, a set of capabilities that, integrated into Velhari fleet systems, would allow the Armada to recognize and respond to the threat moving through deep space. Not just this threat, the category. The Veth had seen versions of this before, and what they were giving was not a specific answer, but a kind of fluency. The ability to read deep space phenomena at a level the Velhari had never achieved, to see what was coming before it arrived, to understand it well enough to find the response that was native to each specific encounter. It was, in the truest sense, knowledge rather than power. I stood in the amber corridor with Thera when the integration completed, and we felt it through the hull of the Sorveth. A change in frequency, subtle, the way a building settles after its foundation is corrected. The Velhari engineers looked at each other with the expression people wear when something works that they were not entirely sure would work. Then one of the junior engineers, a young officer named Vel Sorveth, the name was a clan name, common in the fleet, looked at me and said, very formally, "Thank you, Liaison Osai." I said, "We did it together." The cradle's hull around us pulsed once in its slow respiratory rhythm. Then the light shifted, not off exactly, more like the particular quality of attention the space had carried for 9 days settling back into something older and quieter. The deep sleep quality, the waiting quality. "It's going to leave," Thera said. "Yes," I said, "it'll be back." "When?" "When it's needed again." I thought about it. "It doesn't measure time the way we do, but it'll be here." She was quiet. "Then, will it know to look for humans?" I thought about my grandmother's hand on my shoulder, about the lean of the dark hull when I'd come close, about Vel Meth's 800-year-old scholarship, ignored and then not. "It already knows," I said. I filed my formal report on the cradle encounter on a Thursday, my calendar Thursday, because I'd been keeping track. It was approximately 47 pages, including the technical documentation the engineering team had contributed, and I submitted it to Fleet Commander Arash and copied the Admiralty, and transmitted a version to the Earth Embassy and the Human Velhari Diplomatic Office, and then sat in my slightly smaller than everyone else's quarters and waited. I had left the cradle for the last time 2 hours before filing. The departure was quiet. The Velhari engineers had gone ahead, and I'd spent a few minutes alone in the entry chamber where I'd first come in. No ceremony to it. I just stood there in the amber light and felt the weight of what we'd done settling into place, the way physical weight settles when you've been carrying something for a long time and finally set it down. Not lightness. Just a different kind of heaviness. The good kind. The kind that means something permanent happened, and the world is now different than it was before. I said goodbye. I don't know what I expected or if I expected anything. The cradle's response was the response I'd come to understand over 9 days. The amber light pulsed once, slowly. the handprint warmth at the base of my skull. Then the quality of attention shifted, not gone, not withdrawn, just redirected back into the deep sleep waiting that would carry it through the next interval between gift moments, however long that proved to be. I went back to the shuttle. The reply from the diplomatic office took 6 hours, a formal acknowledgement and a request for a follow-up call, subject line, potential revision to human liaison program scope, which sounded like bureaucratic nothing but was actually significant. Potential revision to scope in diplomatic language means we are reconsidering the fundamental premise of the arrangement. I'd been filed as a liaison, an observer, a polite diplomatic formality. Someone was now reconsidering whether that was accurate, which, given what had just happened, seemed like long overdue paperwork. The reply from Arish came in 20 minutes, which was fast for him. 4 lines, formal Velhari, precisely phrased. It notified me that the Admiralty had, by unanimous vote, formally reclassified my role from human liaison, 3rd Drift Armada, to 1st Bridge Officer, a rank that had not previously existed in the Velhari Fleet Charter and had been created specifically by amendment at the session that morning. I read that twice. Then I looked up the Velhari definition of bridge in the Fleet Charter. It was a ship term, technical, obvious. The bridge was where command lived. But in older Velhari, the word had a second meaning that I'd learned in my 3rd year and then mostly forgotten. Not the place from which you command, but the place between, the thing that joins 2 points that cannot otherwise be joined. The place where you are neither one shore nor the other. The place where the thing you are becomes exactly what is needed. Thera knocked on my door at 1800 hours. I opened it and she was holding 2 cups of something that steamed, which was unusual because Velhari didn't typically drink hot things. She held one out to me. "It's tea," she said. "I've been learning." I took the cup. It was slightly too hot, but that was all right. "You've been learning to drink tea," I said. "I've been learning," she said, "that there are things worth learning that are not native to my world." She held her cup the way someone holds something unfamiliar, careful, deliberate. It seemed like the right time to start. We stood in the doorway of my quarters, which were slightly smaller than everyone else's, and we drank tea. And through the port in the far wall, the stars spread out enormous and clear and full of things coming toward us that we were, for the first time, genuinely ready to understand. Outside, the cradle moved. Slowly, without engine signature, without explanation, the vast dark shape turned in the space between the Armada and the deep black, and then it was leaving. The same way it had arrived, not quickly, not dramatically, just gradually less present, the luminescence fading back into the dark of space until it was nothing but the stars again. But I didn't feel the loss of it. I felt the weight of what it had left behind. Not in the fleet systems, not in the interface documentation, not in the 47-page report. In me, the knowing that had arrived in 11 minutes in an amber corridor, the handprint of recognition at the base of my skull, the sense of being understood, finally, not in spite of what I was, but because of it. All my life I'd been told, kindly and not unkindly, that I was between things. Too young or too old, too formal or too casual, too scientific for the humanists and too humanistic for the scientists. For 4 years I'd been the almost Velhari, the guest, the interesting diplomatic arrangement. I'd swallowed the lesson so deeply I'd started to teach it to myself in the quiet dark of my bunk. You don't fully belong here. You are adjacent to this. You are the one standing beside the thing that matters. Every time I'd attended a briefing where the real decisions had already been made, and my role was to file paperwork about them, I'd reinforced that lesson. Every meal eaten in the commissary alone. Every vacuum formation exercise where I drilled for an operation I would watch from 3 kilometers back. 4 years of practice at being the person who is present but not central, valued but not essential, welcome but not quite at home. I had thought I was failing to become something. I had actually been becoming exactly what I was. The cradle had known different all along. It had been built for this knowledge, built to recognize it across 40,000 years and whatever strange interval of sleeping in the dark between visits. It had waited for the species that evolved a particular skill not from power or longevity, but from necessity. The skill of reaching across the space between things and refusing to let the gap be final. The species that couldn't hear a silence without wanting to fill it with an attempt at communication. The species that crossed vast distances and learned alien languages and sat in rooms where they didn't fully belong and kept showing up anyway, patient and stubborn, and full of the particular kind of hope that has nothing to do with certainty. The cradle had been waiting 60,000 years for the species that was born to stand between. The species that could look at any two things that could not touch and find the gap where connection happened. The species that had walked into every alien context in human history and said, stubborn and terrified and impossible to fully discourage, I want to understand you. Let me try. That was the HFY moment, if you're looking for one. Not the dramatic one, not the moment the hull opened, not the 9 days of engineering. The stubborn, terrified maintenance crawler at 200 moment of going toward the thing that hadn't answered anyone else. We do that, we can't help it. We've been doing it since the first human looked at the dark beyond the fire and thought, I wonder what's out there. The ship chose the human standing beside her. It chose her because she was willing to stand beside it when no one else had thought to try. Thera finished her tea with the careful, deliberate focus of someone new to a thing. Then she looked at me and said, same time tomorrow, first bridge officer. I smiled. Same time tomorrow, vice admiral. The stars were very bright, and the dark between them was full of things we were finally learning to read.